She didn't know what she was looking for when she walked into the woods. He didn't know he was about to speak his first word in over a year. And that lion cub, he didn't know anyone would come back for him. But somewhere between grief and grace, a broken woman, a silent boy, and a forgotten creature found each other. This isn't just a rescue story. It's what happens when love refuses to walk away. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The morning mist clung low across the woods just outside Helena, Montana, blurring the lines between trees and sky. A stillness settled over the pine forest, broken only by the soft hush of wind pushing through the branches. It was late autumn, cold, damp, and gray, the kind of morning where memories feel sharper than the air. Celia Morgan moved carefully through the undergrowth, her boots pressing quietly into the carpet of wet pine needles. She wore a weathered field coat, its cuffs fraying, and a camera slung loosely around her shoulder. In her late 40s. Celia had a slender frame made leaner by years of wandering alone. Her once dark hair was now streaked with gray and pulled into a loose braid that hung low between her shoulders. Her eyes, a pale hazel, held a look of someone who used to laugh easily but hadn't in a long time. 3 years had passed since her son, Aaron, died in a kayaking accident during a school trip. Since then, Celia had withdrawn from Helena's polite circles and slipped instead into the silent spaces between trees and mountains. Wildlife photography became more than a profession. It became her way of breathing. This morning, she had planned to shoot elk near the ridge, but as she veered off trail and stepped deeper into the woods, something tugged at her, an instinct, a presence she couldn't explain. And then she saw it. At the base of a tall pine, nestled between the roots and surrounded by scattered leaves, was a small shape, white and unmoving. Celia froze, a mountain lion cub, a pale, furred coyote. She stepped closer, heart thudding, and her breath caught. A lion, a white lion cub, no older than a few months, was tied to the tree by a rough rope that looped around its midsection and front legs. Its fur, once pure and soft, was now dirt-smeared and tangled. The cub's head hung low, its body trembling so slightly it might have gone unnoticed. Above him, taped clumsily to the tree trunk, a note flapped in the breeze, half curling from the cold. Celia crouched. The wind shifted, revealing the handwriting on the torn notebook page. "His name is Casper. I can't keep him. Please be kind." She reached for her camera, then stopped. This wasn't a moment to capture. It was a life to protect. "Casper," she whispered, voice trembling. The cub didn't respond. Its eyes, the soft blue-gray of a winter lake, flicked toward her but held no fear, just resignation. The rope was pulled tight, biting into his small limbs. Celia's fingers moved toward the knot, but it was stiff and slick with sap. She didn't have a knife. She didn't have scissors, just her bare hands, and her breath clouding in the cold air. She worked slowly, gently, pulling one loop loose, then another. All the while, she whispered softly, not for Casper, but for herself, as if by speaking kindness into the woods, she could make the world hurt a little less. When the last knot fell away, Casper didn't run. He simply sank into the grass at the base of the tree, as if his bones had forgotten what it meant to move. Celia sat beside him, close but not too close. The silence between them felt strangely familiar, far across town, in a small pale blue house on Chestnut Street. A boy sat cross-legged at the foot of his bed. Ben Foster was 12 years old, with a mop of unkempt blonde curls and soft brown eyes that often avoided direct contact. A pile of sketchbooks surrounded him, pages filled with charcoal outlines of deer, foxes, and wolves, animals he'd seen only from the edges of trails or through binoculars. Ben hadn't spoken in over a year. Not since the morning he froze during his class presentation and the panic took hold, tightening his chest, fogging his mind until the words simply disappeared, diagnosed with social anxiety disorder. He had since retreated into a world where language came only through drawings. Ben's mother, Allison, tried to help. She took him to therapy, encouraged outdoor walks, and made space for his silences. But the only thing that seemed to calm him was the forest. The woods were quiet. The animals didn't expect conversation most mornings. Ben slipped out with his sketch pad before the neighborhood stirred. He wore an oversized hoodie and carried a pouch of pencils around his waist. The forest near Helena had become his sanctuary, a place where he could blend into the background and just see. That same morning, while Celia sat quietly next to the trembling lion cub, Ben was heading toward that same stretch of woods, unaware that two broken things had just found each other. The clouds above Helena were low and heavy, the kind that sat motionless in the sky like old grief. Celia Morgan didn't notice them as she drove down the winding gravel road, her knuckles pale around the steering wheel. The white lion cub lay curled in a thick blanket on the passenger seat of her truck, barely moving. She didn't talk, didn't sing, didn't fill the air with anything but the occasional glance, checking to see if he was still breathing. She had named him Casper only because the note had, but somehow, the name already seemed to fit. The Helena Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat nestled at the edge of the woods, where pine trees gave way to open meadows and rust-colored fencing. It was small, just 2 buildings and a wide enclosure. Practical and unpretentious, the kind of place built not for show, but for survival. Inside the intake room, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay. A woman in her late 50s greeted her, Erin Dawson, a quiet but sharp-eyed caretaker with crow's feet etched deeply around her kind eyes. Erin didn't ask many questions. She simply pointed to a heated examination table and began gathering supplies while Cecilia placed Casper gently on the padded surface. "He's dehydrated," Erin murmured after a quiet moment. "No visible wounds. Malnourished, but no fractures. We'll keep him under observation." Celia watched the little cub's side rise and fall. She didn't speak, but when Erin asked if she'd like to stay a while, she nodded without hesitation, and she returned the next day, and the day after that, each morning. She arrived before the sun had fully risen. Sometimes she brought a thermos of coffee for Erin. Other times she sat in silence beside Casper's enclosure, not expecting anything from the cub, simply offering her presence. Slowly, Casper began to move again. Tiny shifts, then small steps. He would look up at her, ears tilted slightly, recognizing her scent or maybe just her stillness. She didn't coo or offer treats. She just stayed. It had been years since Celia felt like she belonged anywhere, not since Erin's accident. She had lived in the margins since then, hiding behind her camera, behind grief, behind distance. But this small creature, silent, damaged, still trying, pulled something loose in her. She found herself humming sometimes on the drive. She cleaned out a spare room she hadn't entered in months. She took down the cardboard box of Erin's old drawings but didn't open it. Not yet. Casper wasn't healing alone. Across town, in a quiet yellow house with white shutters, 12-year-old Ben Foster sat cross-legged on the carpet of his bedroom. He hadn't spoken aloud in almost a year. His voice had retreated into silence after the panic attacks began. First at school, then in the grocery store, then in the middle of a family gathering where the noise had felt like it was pressing in on his chest. He was small for his age, with sandy blonde hair and narrow shoulders, often hidden beneath oversized hoodies. Most days, Ben kept to himself. He sketched animals from the field guides his mother left on the shelf. He spent hours in the backyard, crouched by tree trunks, watching ants and scribbling them into the pages of his worn notebooks. But that week, something had shifted. Ben had wandered into the woods 2 mornings ago. Following a trail he rarely used, he liked the trees there, older, more tangled, less touched by town kids or trail runners. And there, through the thick brush, he had seen her, a woman, kneeling beside a white lion cub tied to a pine tree. She moved slowly, murmured gently. Her fingers worked at the ropes. Ben had hidden behind a tree trunk. Heart pounding, he didn't know why he didn't leave. He just stayed, watching as she freed the creature. That image stuck with him. Now, back in his room, Ben flipped to a new page in his sketchbook and began drawing what he remembered. The pine tree, the rope, the cub. The woman's face turned downward in concentration. His pencil moved faster than usual. For the first time in weeks, he felt the lines taking on something more than shapes. They carried weight, memory, maybe even meaning. Later that evening, his mother, Allison Foster, knocked gently on his door before stepping inside. She was in her early 40s, graceful in a tired way, with soft auburn hair and kind hazel eyes. A clinical child psychologist by trade, she carried the weight of both her profession and her widowhood with quiet strength. Allison had grown used to Ben's silences. She didn't push him anymore, didn't ask for words he wasn't ready to give. Instead, she watched. "What's that?" she asked, nodding to the sketch pad in his lap. Ben tilted the page toward her. She blinked. "That's a lion." He nodded once. "And that's someone helping it." He paused, then nodded again. Allison sat beside him, brushing her fingers over the edge of the paper. "That's beautiful." "Ben, really?" she thought for a moment, then said, "You know, I heard something at the clinic. One of the women at the wildlife center said they've taken in a lion cub this week. A white one." Ben looked up. "I wonder," Allison said softly, "if it's the same one you saw." He didn't move, but something changed in his expression. "I was thinking," she continued, choosing each word carefully. "Maybe we could visit, not for long, just to look. You wouldn't have to talk, you wouldn't even have to draw, just be there. Would that be okay?" Ben didn't nod this time, but he didn't shake his head either. The wind shifted that morning, colder than the day before, sharp with the scent of wet pine and distant thunder. The staff at the Helena Wildlife Rehabilitation Center moved briskly, stacking sandbags near enclosure doors and checking drainage lines. Storms rolled fast through Montana in the late fall, violent, unannounced, and loud, and something in the air felt heavier, like nature itself was holding its breath, inside one of the private enclosures. Casper paced in slow, careful steps. His legs, once stiff with malnourishment, had grown stronger over the past 2 weeks. His white coat, though still patchy in places, shimmered faintly under the skylight as he moved. But it was his eyes, ice gray and endlessly deep, that made him hard to look away from. Eyes that had watched abandonment. Eyes that now followed one person in particular with quiet devotion. Celia Morgan sat just beyond the low wooden rail, cross-legged on the floor. She had stopped bringing her camera. What was the point? She wasn't there to capture anymore. She was there to stay. Casper responded to her presence in a way he didn't with anyone else. He would approach slowly when she arrived, lean gently against the barrier, and press his head toward the opening, as if asking her not to vanish. But each time she stood to leave, a small, aching sound escaped him, half whimper, half sigh, and it struck her like a nail in the heart. She had heard that sound before, from herself, in the quietest parts of grief. Aaron Dawson, the caretaker who managed daily monitoring, noticed, too, he's bonded to you. She said one morning while updating his feeding chart, it's not common, but it happens. They know who stayed. Even wild ones know who stayed. Celia nodded silently. It was during one of those visits, as storm clouds thickened beyond the pine tree line, that everything shifted. A sudden thunderclap cracked through the sky like a whip. The building trembled slightly, the overhead lights flickering. At the first roll, Casper froze. His ears flattened, his body stiffened, then, without warning, he bolted, scrambling into the back corner of his enclosure, knocking over his water bowl, eyes wide and panicked. Celia shot up, heart pounding. Casper. He didn't respond. His body shook so hard it made his ribcage quiver. He pressed himself into the corner wall, tail wrapped tight around his legs. His breath came fast and shallow, as if the air itself had turned against him. Aaron ran in, startled. What happened, Thunder? Celia said, he's terrified. No, Aaron whispered, her face softening as she crouched to peek into the enclosure. That's not fear of noise, that's memory. And suddenly, Celia saw it. The tree, the rope, the storm. She hadn't noticed before, hadn't remembered the way the sky had looked the day she found him, but now it came rushing back, how the leaves had swirled, how the branches had groaned under the wind, how the note had flapped violently in the wind like a flag of surrender. He'd been abandoned in a storm. She moved to the corner of the enclosure, as close as the glass would allow, and knelt. She didn't speak. She didn't coo or call his name. She simply lowered her head and rested her hand against the glass, palm open. Minutes passed, and then, slowly, Casper's body stopped trembling. His eyes lifted, and though he didn't move forward, he looked at her. That was enough, elsewhere. Ben Foster stood by the window of his mother's car, staring through the rain. The windshield wipers moved in slow rhythm as Allison adjusted the heater, her hands steady on the wheel. She had arranged the private visit 2 days earlier, speaking with Mara on the phone, carefully planning a quiet introduction. Today was the day. Ben's sketchpad sat on his lap. He clutched it like a life raft. His fingers trembled slightly, but his eyes never left the road ahead when they arrived. Aaron greeted them at the entrance. We've closed early because of the storm, she said. But he's inside, still in recovery enclosure 3. We can give you some space. Ben nodded once. Allison placed a hand gently on his back. You don't have to speak, she said quietly. Just feel it. Just be there, inside. The building was quieter than usual. The storm outside muffled everything. As they entered the viewing corridor, Ben caught sight of a woman kneeling by the enclosure glass, her coat damp from the rain. Celia. She didn't look up when they stepped in. Casper lay curled in the corner, his head low but his ears alert. His breathing had steadied, but his body was still tucked in defensively. Ben stepped forward. He didn't walk fast, he didn't speak. He simply stood before the glass, reached into his sketch pad, and pulled out the drawing he had completed the night before. It showed Casper beneath the stormy tree. But this time, the ropes were gone. The lion stood on its own, eyes fixed on something in the distance, something hopeful. He pressed the page gently to the glass. Casper lifted his head, and Ben whispered, almost inaudibly, "Beautiful." The word hung in the air like lightning that never struck. Allison gasped, turning toward her son. It was the first sound he had spoken aloud in over a year. Ben's face didn't change. He just stood there, eyes on Casper, mouth closed again, but the damage had been undone. The silence cracked. Celia finally turned. She saw the boy, the drawing, the connection, and for the first time in a long while. She smiled, not the polite kind, not the practiced one. A real smile, a beginning. The days following the storm were clear and sharp. Montana's skies returning to their bright, endless blue. The air smelled of thawed pine and dry earth. But the emotional current around the Helena Wildlife Rehabilitation Center remained taut, like a wire stretched to its edge. Something was shifting, quietly, but unmistakably. Celia Morgan stood at the front desk of the center's modest office building, a folder clutched in her hand. Her knuckles were white around its edges. She hadn't dressed up for this. No makeup, no careful outfit. Just her faded denim jacket, a scarf that still smelled faintly of pine smoke, and jeans she wore into the woods. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here for Casper. Across from her sat Julia Freeman, the center's part-time administrator and legal coordinator. Julia was in her early 30s, with short dark hair, glasses always sliding down her nose, and a patient, precise demeanor. She had a calm voice, the kind you trusted to explain complicated things. But Celia's heart raced as she watched Julia flip slowly through the documents she had filled out. Application forms, home visit requests, references. "I want to foster him," Celia said softly, "or adopt. Whichever gets him out of the enclosure and somewhere he can heal properly." Julia gave her a gentle look. "I believe you." "Celia, but because of his exotic species classification, we have to process everything through the state. It's not just up to us." "How long? 4 to 6 weeks, depending on verification." Celia swallowed, her throat dry. "He doesn't have 6 weeks." Before Julia could answer, the office door opened. The man who stepped in wore a tailored brown coat and dark slacks, completely out of place in the pine-scented building. He was tall, in his 50s, with thick silver hair swept back and a sharp, handsome face that carried itself like a signature. His boots were polished. His eyes were pale blue and cold. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "I was told I needed to come in person to reclaim my animal." Celia turned, instantly wary. "Your animal?" The man looked at her briefly, then back to Julia. "Yes, the white lion cub. His name is Snow. I have papers to prove ownership." Julia blinked. "Do you have those documents with you?" He slid a manila envelope across the counter. "Birth records. Imported legally 2 years ago through a conservation exchange. I have transport certification as well." Celia's pulse roared in her ears. He was tied to a tree. The man shrugged. "Runaway. Slipped the enclosure. We searched for him for days. No note." Celia snapped. "No rescue call." He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "We didn't want media attention." Julia looked between them, visibly uncomfortable. "We'll have to verify all claims. We need time." Celia stepped back, her entire body tense. She couldn't believe it, couldn't believe this man, with his perfect jacket and clinical detachment, could be the one who left that fragile cub to die in the woods, outside the office. Casper was lying in the sun near the corner of his enclosure, his body stretched out but alert, when Celia walked past the glass. He raised his head immediately. She touched her palm to the window. He pressed his nose to the other side. She whispered, "I'm not letting anyone take you away again." Meanwhile, at the foster home, Ben was seated at the kitchen table. A new drawing spread out before him. Colored pencils lay scattered across the wood. His mother, Allison, was chopping vegetables near the sink but kept glancing over with a soft smile. The house had changed lately, still quiet, but not silent, not broken. Ben had spoken 3 full sentences that morning, not just whispered words, but complete thoughts. He'd asked for toast. He'd asked where they were going that afternoon, and then he'd said, "I want to show Celia this drawing." On the paper, Casper stood tall and proud between 2 women, one with curly auburn hair pulled into a bun and a tired smile. Allison, the other was Celia, drawn in her long coat with a hand resting gently on the lion's back. Behind them stretched open pines and blue sky. Allison moved to his side and looked down at the image. "Is that us?" Ben nodded. She rested her hand on his shoulder. "You think of her as part of your world now." He hesitated, then replied, "Casper is, and she came with him." Allison swallowed the emotion rising in her chest. She had spent years trying to reach her son, through words, therapy, silence. But in the end, it had taken a lion cub to help him find the words again. Back at the center, Celia paced the perimeter of Casper's enclosure. Julia had agreed to place a temporary hold on any transfer, pending full investigation, but it was clear from the man's confident stance that he wasn't used to hearing no. Later that afternoon, he returned with a lawyer. "Temporary holding violates my property rights." The attorney began. She was a sharp-faced woman in a navy suit named Deanna Hart, with tightly bound black hair and a tone that left no room for empathy. "If this isn't resolved quickly, we will file a motion to reclaim the animal." Celia stood by quietly as Julia explained the legal process again, but her heart thundered with fear. She had seen men like this before, people who could buy silence, control systems, spin narratives. She knew, deep in her gut, that if Casper left with them, he wouldn't be seen again. That night, she returned to the enclosure after hours. Aaron let her in, locking the door behind her. The building was dim, lit only by amber hallway lights and the soft hum of ventilation. Casper stirred from sleep and padded over to the glass. She pressed her forehead to it. "I don't know how yet," she whispered, "but I'm going to fight for you." And through the window, Casper looked into her, eyes filled with something that didn't need translation. Not fear, not sadness. Trust. The first golden leaves of October fell like memories over the town of Helena, carpeting sidewalks and rooftops in quiet color. The days were growing shorter, but the air was warm enough to carry the scent of pine and cedar, wrapping the town in a kind of early goodbye to summer. In a small office tucked behind the Helena Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Julia Freeman slid a folder across her desk toward Celia Morgan with both hands and a soft smile. "It's official," she said. "The board reviewed everything. He's yours." Celia stared at the folder like it was a delicate thing, like touching it too hard might make it vanish. Then she opened it. Inside were the finalized papers, stamped and signed, proof that Casper, the white lion cub once tied to a tree with a note pleading for kindness, had been granted into her care permanently. There was a weight in that decision, but it was the kind that settled over her shoulders gently, like a blanket. Not a burden, The man who had claimed ownership had vanished after the state authorities requested proof of custody beyond the imported documentation. As it turned out, no rescue report had ever been filed. No microchip was registered to his name, and the certificate he'd presented was traced to a private breeder in Nevada who hadn't heard from him in nearly a year. The papers crumbled. So did the claim. The lion was never his to begin with. Celia walked back to the enclosure where Casper waited, pacing lightly beneath the low wooden roof. His eyes brightened when he saw her, the way they always did now. She knelt by the door, and when Aaron unlocked it from the inside, the cub trotted into her arms without hesitation, brushing his head against her shoulder like a greeting, like a promise. Ready to go home, she whispered into his fur. The cabin sat on the edge of Bitterroot Forest, a 30-minute drive from town, and just far enough from the noise of Helena that you could hear your own breath at night. It was a single-story structure Celia had inherited from her father's cousin years ago and had rarely visited until recently. She spent 2 days preparing it before bringing Casper home, installing a large outdoor enclosure with tall, reinforced fencing, lining the inside with straw, logs, and shaded corners, and adding a soft bed in the sunroom where he could rest beside her. The first night, he didn't sleep far from her, though she left the enclosure open and the doors unlatched. He curled near her feet, his breaths steady and slow. At some point in the early morning, she awoke to find his head on her thigh, his ear flicking lightly as if in a dream. Outside, the trees whispered like old friends. Meanwhile, in the heart of Helena, Ben Foster stood in the middle of the town library's community room, gripping the edge of a podium too tall for him by just a few inches. The walls were lined with string-lit displays of drawings, his drawings, dozens of pages tacked carefully to corkboards and panels. They showed Casper's journey, the first sketch beneath the pine, the trembling in the enclosure, the storm, the gaze between boy and lion. And finally, Casper standing proud beside 2 women, strong and calm. The room was filled with chairs, and those chairs were filled with people, neighbors, teachers, volunteers from the Wildlife Center, and children from his therapy group. Allison stood near the back, her hand resting gently over her heart. Ben adjusted the microphone, took a breath, and started. "My name is Ben," he said, his voice soft but clear, "and these drawings are about Casper." He paused, eyes locked on him. I didn't talk for a long time. I was scared of everything. Then I saw him, tied up, alone, but still trying. I didn't know why it mattered so much, but I started drawing, and drawing made it easier to breathe. He looked toward his mother. Casper didn't save me with words, he just stayed, and that taught me how to stay too. A pause, then applause, the kind that begins slow but builds into something warm, like a tide coming in. Allison wiped her eyes and smiled. Not the polite kind, the real kind. That weekend. Celia loaded the truck with a blanket, a thermos, and Casper's favorite toy, a chewed-up leather pouch filled with lavender. He leapt into the back without hesitation, his body grown stronger, leaner, but still holding that quiet nobility only some creatures are born with. They drove slowly, taking the winding roads that led deeper into the hills. The sky was streaked with amber and rose by the time they pulled to a stop at the edge of the old trail. Celia opened the door, and Casper followed her on foot, paws brushing against fallen needles and soft moss. The tree was still there, weathered, gnarled, silent. She crouched beside it, placed a hand on the bark, and pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat. The original note, now laminated, edges creased but intact. "His name is Casper. I can't keep him. Please be kind. And beneath it, written in Celia's calm, looping script, he found a home, and he is deeply, deeply loved. She affixed the note gently with clear tape, letting it rest just above the base, like a memorial and a message at once. Casper didn't approach the tree. He stood beside her, staring upward, then to her side, then finally lowered himself onto the ground and rested his head on her boot. She looked down at him. "We're not going back," she said, "only forward." The wind moved through the branches. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and the forest watched as two beings, once abandoned, now found, sat quietly in the fading light, not needing to speak, not needing to explain, just staying. Together, sometimes. Miracles do not arrive with trumpets or blinding lights. Sometimes they come quietly, tied to a tree in the middle of a forest, wrapped in silence and waiting for someone to see them. Casper was not just a lion. He was a reminder that love often begins in broken places, and that God doesn't always send angels with wings. Sometimes he sends us a second chance on 4 paws. Celia stayed, Ben found his voice, and Casper, once abandoned, became the thread that wove healing through hearts that had long forgotten how to hope. This was no coincidence, this was grace. In everyday life, we may walk past pain we don't recognize, or miracles we don't name, but when we stop, when we care, when we stay, God works through us. That is where healing begins. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need to be reminded that no one is too lost to be found. Leave a comment below with Amen if you believe that love, faith, and kindness still change lives. Subscribe to the channel to follow more stories of hope. And may God bless every single one of you who stayed until the end. From our family to yours, never stop believing in small miracles,